So we're going to begin to look at the Apostle John's letter or writing of the book of Revelation. And as mentioned before, and what we've done through most of our study through the scriptures has been take more of an overview look at the scriptures as a whole, making note of the line of the thread of God's purpose throughout actually the history of mankind and through all the writings of the scriptures. So I did give a brief mention about the writing of Revelation, the nature of this writing, and that we would be not, of course, doing any kind of in-depth study. It's very typical. I remember, I remember growing up, Revelation was a book that had a lot of mystery surrounding it, and that's primarily because of the sheer amount of imagery presented in the book. It's very hard to make sense of it. Many theologians and other creative artists have tried to, whether that be through illustrative depictions, drawings, movies, different things have come out to try and offer some kind of explanation, understanding, timeline, etc., related to the writings in this book. And so, at the time that I was growing up, so I was born in the 70s, and I think it was in the 60s and 70s that there were a few movies that were produced about this book, and they were really focused on something very typical, and that being that Revelation is a timeline of end-time events. I will say right off the bat that that's not the way that I think Revelation should be approached. It's not the way that it should be pursued, or any understanding related to this writing is really not going to come if you're looking to this book to have some kind of understanding of of an order of events that will take place, quote unquote, at the end of time. But that has been the majority interpretation of this writing. So I'll come back to that in a moment. But, like I was saying when I was young, because of that approach and because of the very interesting imagery that is described throughout this writing, as a young person, it was very intriguing to me. And I think it was to all, it was perceived as a book that talks about God's judgment against evil and all the things that would happen. And when reading it, even I'm trying to kind of recall some events. I remember when I was in Bible college, and we began to study this particular writing. You can always sense the anticipation around this writing when anyone's going to teach on it, because it's so mysterious. So that I think what gets stirred up many times is well, what will this person's interpretation of the end time be? Because it's all based on the assumption that Revelation has something to say about the predictions of times, dates, and happenings. I know I may sound a little bit repetitive, but I'm trying to get to a point here. And so I remember that class that I took, and I remember coming away from that class feeling very unsatisfied. I think that there were some basic principles about Revelation in the sense of faithfully enduring that I took away. And then there have been others who have tried to offer teachings on this particular book. Now, later on when I was on staff with Mission Possible in Austin, and we were doing a Bible study, I had a number of people who would come to me constantly to ask if we could study when or if we could study the Book of Revelation. And interestingly, as ignorant as I would have been in that time of my life, there was still something within me, indicated by the Spirit of the Lord very evidently. I even knew that at the time, that, pretty much said in my inner person, you don't even know what you're talking about. Don't touch that book. And so maybe part of me thought of that because of the controversy that surrounds, the way that people believe the culmination of events in the earth will take place. And as God has continued in my own walk, as I have gained some understanding, especially of God's purposes, and to see how the settlement of the truth of God's purposes begin to create a foundation for my own spiritual walk, then I have been, more and more through the years, and at this point completely released or resigned of the idea that Revelation is a prediction book. So one last comment about this topic. When I was in college, I read the series of books, called Left Behind, which those were some of, along the lines of even some of the movies that have been created previously to that, basically using some more modern contemporary prophets' explanation visually in movies and otherwise, and even in books, these books that they wrote. And it was almost like they were trying to go step by step through the timeline of events in Revelation and correlating them quite directly to the unfolding of certain events in human history. Now, don't get me wrong, there will be things in human history that unfold that will correlate to the fulfillment of things that were foretold in the scriptures. And that doesn't just include Revelation. That includes the whole of the words of the prophets and the fulfillment of God's purposes. So that's a very general and broad stroke about quote-unquote future events. So one of the reasons I'm taking a moment to talk about it in this way is because in today's Christianity, especially in the evangelical conservative portion, which makes up the majority of Western Christianity, specifically that being in the United States of America, in its greatest majority. And then it has this same perspective or doctrines and theologies have been taken back even to other parts of the world, countries, everything else. So this same majority mindset remains, that Revelation is a book of predictions. They're mysterious. Not very many people understand them, but that's just what it is, and that's the way we should understand it. So anyone that talks or thinks about Revelation is thinking about eschatology, okay? Eschatology is the end times, or the study of the end times, okay? That's very fascinating to me, because while the prophets, even some very, very ancient prophets and prophetic writings from early times, Job and the book of Enoch and others that were written, they talk about the end times. Jesus talked about the end times. The Old Testament prophet talked about the last days. And then the apostles following Christ talked about the last days. And in the evangelical mind, the desire for understanding always comes on, okay, when are we going to be, taken out of the earth? Or, when is God's judgment, the day of the Lord, going to happen? And we look at it as we consider that in our minds as a singular event. And so we're taking what is truly in the mind of the Lord, a principle or a concept of fulfillment and completion, and we're trying to narrow that down into the linear way of thinking in time and space that we are, as human beings, pretty confined to. And that confinement is directly correlated to the earthly life and the perspective of that earthly life. I think that you will find, as you continue to grow and mature spiritually and begin to have when God begins to give to you through the Spirit a deeper understanding and revelation of the spiritual realms, then what's interesting about the spiritual realms and the heavenly realms in particular, as opposed to the realm of the earth and creation, the cosmos, all the created order, is that in the heavenly realms and the dwelling, which is the dwelling place of God, there time and space, so linear time, moment after moment, day after day, year after year, does not have a direct control over the events in that realm. And so when God speaks from the heavenly realms about the culmination of certain things, it is not about time and space fulfillment, although that will have its place inevitably, but that should not be our pursuit and understanding. Now, this is not new for man to try to nail down times and dates. I think it's an appropriate time to mention that when God revealed to his people through Moses and the law the times and the dates that they were to set apart for him in their own midst, were not given to them by calendar dates and times. And we're coming into a season in just 10 days or so where we're going to be celebrating the Feast of Passover. Now, when God appointed these times, these seasons, they were not, again, given by time and date. So, in other words, on this specific day, okay, because the calendar for the Hebrews, and this is not just because it was back in an older time where they didn't have wall clocks and wristwatches. There was something very specific that should still be a message to our own hearts and understanding of God's ways and God's timing. So when the Feast of Passover begins, or when any of the appointed feasts begin, the priests of God were to go out and they were to look for the signs. And when the signs that they were to look for were confirmed, then they would communicate to the people, now is the time. Okay? Now we just say, okay, at 9:37 on March 17th, such and such, we'll do this. Okay? But that's not how God ordained for his people to, quote unquote, understand or tell the time, to determine, to discern the time. God had a very specific order by which his times and dates were to be known. That's very fascinating to me. It's a little bit of a developing concept in my mind, but and we'll look at this again, but when Jesus began to talk about the last days in Matthew 24 and Mark 13, he could see the quandary in the eyes and hearts and minds of the disciples around him. And so he knew that the question on their heart, and they even asked it, well, when is all this going to happen? Tell us the time, the date. And he said, no one knows. The angels in heaven don't know. Even the Son doesn't know. He said, I don't know. That's God's thing. The timing there is God's thing. Now, funny enough, we even though we have all this in the scriptures that point us to how God, quote unquote, tells time, we don't follow that order. We still, especially in today's time or contemporary thinking, we want a specific declaration. That's what we think would be truly predictive. And so, but even Jesus said he didn't know because he understood the timing of the Father. I'm using time a lot. But so back to the order, because there's a lot. I want this to be settled in your heart and your mind about an approach to prophetic literature in general, and specifically about, because these same principles about the fulfillment of God's purposes can be applied to all prophecy, especially that which is written in the scriptures. And I think that's particularly meaningful because we're very near to celebrating as a people the Feast of Passover. And so, while we have, even look the way that we've done certain things, we already have decided days and times where we will do certain things in order to celebrate this season. But I want us to see beyond the direct engagement, even as a people here with our folks here in Port Angeles, Washington. We're not focusing in on the day and time, but rather the season and God's purpose in it. And we'll discuss that further about Passover and the feast as we engage in those as families. But my point here is that God had an order by which those seasons were to be determined, okay? So it was done by the witness of more than one, 2 or 3 witnesses at least had to see the same signs, okay? And then in this particular case with the feasts, it had to do with the seeing or observing the moon in a particular state, okay? So some moons were more difficult to discern than others. And I think, I actually last night, I was, after you and I got home, and it was right at dusk, and I walked up the hill toward the top of our property, and just over the crest of this ridge right here, I saw the tiniest little sliver of a moon. It was really beautiful because the sun was setting, so there were some red and orange hues in the sky, and then over to the southwest was the moon, and it was just a very, very, very thin sliver of a moon. Now, out here especially, where we get a lot of cloud cover and rain from during this time of the year, it would be very easy for a cloud to cover that little tiny sliver of a moon. I mean, it's not putting off much light. So sometimes when the moon is full and very bright at night, even if a cloud crosses over it, you can still see the reflective glow behind the cloud, right? All to say, God said, first of all, he didn't just say, whoever sees this can just go tell everybody or the people he knows or keep it to himself what he sees about this phase of the moon and the time of the year when we're supposed to celebrate this appointed feast. No, God said, I have ordained leadership that I approve of in the midst of the people who are called by my name, and those within their midst who have my approval to be appointed to fulfill certain tasks that I give them. They will be the ones who determine the time. And God wasn't doing that saying they are this and the people are not. He was doing it for the sake of the people, that they might know and be secure in the way that God reveals himself. So God appointed the priests, and those priests would be spread out into certain parts, and they would be all eager. The people would be waiting. The priests would be looking and they would be anticipating the observation of the moon at the particular point during this time of the year, so that they would know, now this is the time. These will be the days when we celebrate what God has told us to do. Now, we know that God had 3 appointed feasts, culminating in the Great Feast of Tabernacles. They were all determined in the same way and in this same order. And that was to be as a sign and symbol to the peoples. Not only, let me just show you this from the very beginning, how the Lord ordered this. In Genesis 1:1, 1:14, it says, "And God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night. Let them serve as signs to mark seasons and days and years." So we may read that and, with our Western mindset and think of only our Gregorian calendar and say, oh, there's 365 days in a year, and the year turns at this time, and this month leads to that month, and this day leads to that day, and there's 7 days, and there's 24 hours in it, and that's how we think. But that's not how the Torah was written. If you read the Torah and you read the law, the oracles of God and how God related to man and how he wanted man to seek after him, to wait for him, to anticipate, bending an ear, squinting the eye, looking for, pressing into, not just what God would do with some big question mark. That's applicable from time to time. But God has in many ways declared what he will do, and man has in many ways, looked for it. The prophet Jeremiah said, "You will seek me if you find me, if you seek me with your whole heart." The whole principle there is how we are looking. It's not that God cannot be found. It's that God wants to be found and known and understood in a particular way. And he has showed us that way. Now, ultimately, we see through the apostles and through the life of Jesus, Jesus said, "I am that way to the Father. I am the way to know the Father, to understand the Father. There is no other way except for this way." And when Jesus said that, he wasn't saying, say this prayer because that's the only way. He was saying, take observation of the way of life that is lived by the Son of God, because that way of life is the only way to the Father. And Jesus' way of life was the fulfillment of what was foretold or foreshadowed in everything that was in the law and prophets. That's why Jesus, when he came and he taught, he said, "I haven't come to abolish the law. I'm not getting rid of it." He said it will be filled to the last jot and tittle. But my way of life will fulfill everything that God desired to be fulfilled in the law. Every requirement of the law will be fulfilled by this way of life. And I'm going to show it to you so you can do it. But it's after the pattern of this way of life. Now, I may seem like I'm going very off subject, but this, folks, is a better foreground for understanding prophetic writings. Because this particular, since we're looking at Revelation and not Isaiah or Jeremiah or some of the others that we've gone through, it can't be studied and quote unquote studied, line by line, precept by precept. The nature of this writing is both spiritual and mystical. It is meant to be revealed. We're going to talk about that a little bit more as we continue in this introduction. what is revealed, there are different timings in the revelation or the opening of the understanding of prophetic writings, and this writing in particular. And that's not uncommon. It's God's good pleasure to reveal himself in such a way, and in various times and seasons. Jesus did that. Even, I've mentioned this a couple times as an example. When he was walking on the road to Emmaus after his resurrection, and he found some disciples, and they were talking about everything that had happened to Jesus, and he came along and walked with them and talked with them, and they thought, he asked them, "Hey, what are you guys talking about?" And he was like, they responded in wonder to him. "Well, man, where have you been? Don't you know what happened to Jesus Nazareth? And we thought he was the Messiah." And it's very interesting to see what they thought about it. We thought it was going to happen this way. And then Jesus, in hearing the way that they were understanding the scriptures, because up until that point, they had no understanding of the scriptures. And he said so himself. "Haven't you read the scriptures? Don't you understand?" And then it says, and he opened up the scriptures. That's a time. That's a place. That's an appointed time. For them, the scriptures and the truth and the revelation that was to be made known by God had not yet been unveiled. It hadn't manifested itself yet. But God appointed that time in their lives, in that moment. Who can predict that? It came when God himself said, "It's now. Now's the time." And it says, and Jesus opened the scriptures to them. Then they really understood not just who the Messiah was or was for, but what God's purpose was for the Messiah's life. So let's turn back over to Revelation. Revelation is not meant to be a predictive book. Don't read anything or listen to someone who is telling you, "Here's what's going to happen on this time, this date, in this nation, with these people." That's just not wise. They've already approached this writing in a way that will be misleading. It can't be studied that way. We will not, obviously, study it that way. Much of our time will be spent in this introduction and then in a few portions of that scripture. Otherwise, we need to be patient and wait with a seeking heart for God to reveal his truth in his time, in his way. There are so many facets, so many levels of how the truth that is in this writing can be understood and applied, and they don't oppose one another, and they do not cancel one another out. As an example, there are certain truths contained within this writing that can be revealed to an individual believer according to God's own will and purpose, as he reveals for that person about their walk with the Lord and about the inner work of the Spirit in their life. There's a whole nother matter of revelation that comes to the body of Christ as a whole that is revealed at a certain time. In between that, it is also revealed to the servants of God. So there alone are three different facets of the revelation of truth. And that can be applied to all Scripture. Certainly it should be applied to this writing as well. So, Revelation, the word used to describe this book The Greek word is actually apocalypto. What do you guys think of when you hear apocalypto? Apocalypse. Similar word, very similar meaning. What does apocalypse mean to you? When you hear apocalypse, what is it? What do you think of? The end of the world. Now, we have a very particular idea of what the end of the world looks like. From Hollywood's perspective, it's, the nuclear bombs and the big meteorites and the big floods and the turning of the magnetic cores and everything gets destroyed. So it's all destruction, right? That's the most common understanding of what the end of time means. So I'm not going to try to offer a specific definition of the end of the world or the end of time, but I will give you a more broad understanding from the perspective of the revelation of God's purpose. And that is that the oppressive rule of Satan and the enemy as a whole will come to an end. And there will be judgment against it. In a similar fashion, the ways of the world and all the pursuits of man and all the desires of the flesh of man will also come to a place where they are fully exposed and brought to an end, because another way will have been manifest as a better way, and God will judge between the two. Now, what happens to the earth in way of fires and destructions and whatever else? Well, the scriptures clearly say those things will happen. But I don't believe that it is those things that define what the scriptures define to be the end. The end is more of the playing out and about a culmination or a fulfillment. Okay? See, we think of the end as a time of, there's a cutting off and then a sudden darkness afterwards. There's nothing after the end. Now, in the Christian's mind, the end is the end of the world and we all live somewhere else in heaven. Whatever we understand that to be. Now, I don't understand heaven to be, I don't define heaven in that way. Nor do I define the end as this cutoff and darkness and nothing afterwards. There will be an end to Satan's rule and oppression. There will be an end to the pursuits of man throughout the generations. They will come to a point, and they will be able to go no further. The rule of man on earth, which is in a direct correlation with the rule of the enemy and the principalities that are against God's purposes, they too will come to an end. That's the true nature of the end, but it's only in the end of those things, whereas God's kingdom never ends. So this is something that, if we want to talk about prophetic literature and mentionings, well, Nebuchadnezzar, when he had his dreams of all the kingdoms of the world, and then finally the kingdom of God coming, he himself had to recognize, and several of the kings or emperors during that time verbally attested, gave testimony to their people that they ruled over, that the God of the Israelites, the God of Daniel and others, was not like the kings of the world, the rulers of the world. Because they come and they go, they rise and they fall, and their kingdoms with them. But they recognized, whoa, this kingdom of God, the rule of God, the nature of his rule and his kingdom is without end. Even Paul in Hebrews says that he was quoting prophecy and Revelation himself. He said that the Lord himself said that he would shake everything again that can be shaken in heaven and on earth. And only what cannot be shaken will endure. You see, there is an enduring. There is something that goes on. And that's so important for us to understand. We need to kind of break whatever, and you guys may have less of it obviously than I do, or those who may have been raised in the church to think in a very particular way about the end or end time events. If there's one thing that I can more generally say about the proclamations of things that will quote unquote happen, even if they are described in a very illustrative and mystical way as they are in Revelation, that it's not so much about an end as it is a culmination, a fulfillment of God's purpose. So, in essence, what John is communicating from what he heard from Jesus, who was given what he knows to John by what he received from the Father, it is, here's how I will fulfill everything that I have said I would do. This is the fulfillment of God's purpose. That's a very different way to look at prophetic writings. Because it doesn't focus on times and dates. It focuses more on what and why was God trying to accomplish what he said he was doing. What was he after? What is his intention? So something that we talked about, Kayla, early on when we were going through the Torah and other books of the Bible, we continually ask, why did God do what he did in the way that he did it? That's something that we ask again and again, because that became very important to God in his relationship and communication to his people. Why did I do? Are you asking me why I did what I did in the way that I did it? And that was something that Israel and mankind for many generations, they've never even sought God in such a way. They may shake their fist at the heavens and say, why God? Why me? Why this? Why now? But not because something in them is crying out to understand God himself or to know God himself. And as we studied through John and others, we can see that God, because he is light, is the one who is always revealing himself. He is always revealing himself perpetually, ever, always. But man, in his own darkness and heart, is not postured, in a sense, to be able to receive what God is revealing. Now, looking back at this word apocalypto, I got a little off on that. The apocalypse, okay? Apocalypto doesn't mean the end times. It doesn't mean the end of the world. Somehow, whether it be Western theology or movies or whatever it is, these writings and all these predictive books and, here's how to understand prophecy. All these things have offered the wrong idea. They're not even looking at the meaning of the word. Apocalypto means to lay open what has been veiled or cover up, to make manifest, to make it known. Does that sound like the end of the world to you? Doesn't sound like the end of the world to me. What is it that God is making known? Well, I'll tell you one portion of it. Jesus himself said about these things, not even the Son of Man knows, but once the Son of Man, Jesus Christ, had ascended to heaven, the Father showed him. And he came back to reveal a certain portion of that to John for a specific reason, not just predictive in nature. So an extension of that definition is to make known, manifest, to disclose or make known or open up what was previously unknown. Now, that's an interesting statement to me as well. Because there's a portion in Revelation and then there's portions of other prophetic writings like Daniel, where Daniel begins to ask questions and say, well, hey, when's this going to happen? And, those kinds of things. And, Daniel is told, Daniel, don't worry about that. That is for another time and another people. You know what the Lord was saying there? It's not for you to understand right now. I'm not going to apocalypto. I'm not going to reveal that. I'm not going to give you that revelation right now. Revelation does not mean the end. It actually means the beginning of understanding. Something's made known that wasn't known before. Jesus told his disciples the same principle. There have been many prophets and kings and angels who have looked into what is being opened up to you right now. I want you guys to get a little excited, at least inside, about this, because God has appointed times in your own life and in your spiritual growth where he will open things up to you. You can't force those times. It's not going to be because, you pray and ask again and again and again that he does that. It is according to his perfect time and good pleasure that he will do that, but we can expect it. He will open things up to you spiritually. He will, in that sense, allow you to continue on in your growth and maturity in your spiritual life and walk in relationship with him, in your knowledge of him. This is a principle throughout all the scriptures. Here in Revelation, there are certain things that were revealed to John, and specifically about the trumpets and the scrolls and the thunders. And at one point, John's going to write down what he sees in the seven thunders, and the Lord says, "Don't write that down. That is for another time. It's going to be what they call sealed up for right now." The same thing that was told to Daniel. Well, does that mean that it will never be understood or known? No, that's absolutely not what it means. Jesus clearly said to his disciples, you are something that was previously not known to others is now being made known to you. Paul talked about this same principle in Corinthians. I think it's 1 Corinthians. Yeah. And he was quoting Isaiah. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 6, he says, "We do, however, speak a message of wisdom among the mature, but not the wisdom of this age or of the rulers of this age." These same characters and players that I've been talking about, who are coming to nothing. You see, they will have an end, but God's kingdom and its citizens will not. So there will be certain things that come to an end and other things that endure forever, according to God's will and purpose. No, we speak of God's secret wisdom, a wisdom that has been hidden, veiled, covered up, undisclosed, not yet apocalypto, revealed, revelation. Not yet. But now, Paul's saying, and that God destined for our glory. What did God destine? That's very interesting. God appointed a time, a season, and a people within the time of that season who would receive this revelation, this opening up, this unveiling, this manifestation of truth and understanding. He destined it for our glory before time began. So God had already decided that before he created. None of the rulers of this age understood it, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. However, as it is written, this is a quote from Isaiah, "No eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind has conceived what God has prepared for those who love him." Now, interestingly, this revelation was coming directly in that time to Paul, and he was saying, there's something new being revealed right now, and he goes on to say that, but God has revealed it to us, the apostles, by his Spirit. And then they are coming and saying, we want to make this mystery known to you. So this, all the way through the end of this chapter, we see something about the revealing of truth from God's Spirit. The Spirit searches all things, even the deep things of God. For who among men knows the thoughts of man except the man's spirit within him? In the same way, no one knows the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. And we have not received the spirit of the world, which will come to its end, but the Spirit who is from God, that we may understand what God has freely given us. Now, Paul is conceptually talking about some particular revelations in relation to the purpose of the life of Jesus Christ, which all follows the same end. This is what we speak, not in words taught by human wisdom, but in words taught by the Spirit, expressing spiritual truths in spiritual words. The man without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God. Why? For they are foolishness to him, and he cannot understand them. But why? Why do they seem like foolishness, and why can't he understand them? This is key right here. Because they are spiritually discerned. Okay? Spiritual man makes judgments about all things, but he himself is not subject to any man's judgment. For who has known the mind of the Lord that he may instruct him? But we have the mind of Christ. Now, there is also an aspect of timing that is at play here. So, and I say that because it is not simply that, a person becomes, quote unquote, more spiritual, and then all of a sudden they have understanding. God is the one who, through his Spirit, reveals. And we can see that taking place here. John was caught up into the Spirit and received these revelations. So continuing on, let's move back over to Revelation. We're not actually going to be in more than a couple of verses today. And we may even still finish the introduction later because I think that the context for this book and understanding that context will better position us personally and as a people of God to be able to receive the revealed truth as God makes it known. So, something that I referenced before, but I'll repeat again. This is a spiritual writing. It's not just an allegorical writing. It's not just an illustrative writing of visions and impartations. There is a power in the Word. And God is the one who appoints the time and season and people to whom the truth is revealed. That's his choice. That's what I mean when I say, well, it's his good pleasure. It's the way he chose to do that. So, again, this is not a book that is, or writing that is to be, quote unquote, interpreted or even approached by the familiar methods of Bible study or word study, hermeneutics, the way that scholars try to make sense of things. That's literally cannot apply to this writing. So, because this is the prophetic nature of this writing, it's not anyone who approaches this writing in this way typically comes out with a prediction. And this is not a writing that was, God did not send Jesus to John so that John could help us make predictions for a timeline of future events. It is, however, a foresight, a look into the fulfillment of God's eternal purpose in creation and in with man, through the history of man, through his relationship with mankind throughout the ages. He wants his purpose to be known. And there is a time an age, a season wherein this unveiling will take place. Now, briefly looking back at, and you can hold your mark there if you want to, back in Matthew 24. Jesus himself in Matthew 24:36 no one knows about the day or the hour, not the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. And then in verse, he gives some illustration there about Noah's time. 42, therefore keep watch. Interesting in what I was mentioning about the determination of God's times and seasons, right? The priests were to go out and they were to look for this exact phase of the moon so that they could determine the times and dates that God had set apart. Therefore keep watch, because you don't know on what day your Lord will come. But he said, understand this, if the owner of the house had known what time of the night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let his house be broken into. So you must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. Then he talks about the faithful servant. So the preparation is a posture and positioning of expectation. Be watchful. Keep watch. Okay? So, considering Revelation in this light, I mean, Jesus was talking about the end times in that particular chapter in Matthew. It cannot simply be predictive in its message, because it is the point here is that the intention, the purpose of God is what is being made known, and in a particular way. Okay? There's one other thing that I want to do that is more introductory in nature, but we're not going to have time for it. But I'll just mention it so that we can kind of brief our minds, and maybe if you want to reread, just I'll give you some scriptures to read for the week, in a couple of themes to think about, and we'll finish the introduction next week, and then look at a few verses of the actual introduction of Revelation that John writes, of the writing, and that is, I mentioned it briefly just now, but there's a concept of things being sealed up. Okay, so that will kind of finish up our discussion about the timing of God. Okay, so some scriptures you could look at would be Revelation 10, 4 through 7, Matthew 24 would be a chapter you could read, Mark 13, so Revelation 10, 4 through 7. Matthew 24, obviously we just read 36. You can read the whole chapter, though. I think Mark 13, and that's an interesting one, I think, because he says in Mark 13, and it's very similar to chapter 24 in Matthew, but I think he says something very specific. The title of that chapter is Signs of the End of the Age. It may be somewhere in Matthew as well, where he says, this is how you will know, this is how you will determine the time. And when Jesus says that, he's not talking about being able to predict a date. It's about being able to be aware of the day and time and season of God's purpose that you are living in. And as we continue with the study, we will have some conversation about this day and this time that we live in. And we're not going to try and directly correlate it to certain events so much as to come away with a settled understanding of who we are and why God appointed us to live in this day and this time and not some other. That's important to think about, because that should have a great bearing on your lives and how you look at the priority of your life and what you pursue in life, who you are, what you will be, who you will be for, what you will do, what you will commit yourself to, where you will go, what you will say. If you don't know the time and season that you live in, then you would be walking as a blind person in life, doing certain things, going certain places, but not fulfilling anything in relation to the eternal purpose of God. Now, our hope and prayer is that you guys never go on such a path that is so far separated from God's purpose. So hopefully we can use our time in a study like this to realign if necessary, and then more properly fasten and commit our lives to that path in fulfillment of God's purpose. Another one would be in Daniel 12. And those several passages that I just mentioned are going to be in relation to the sealing up, or this concept of an appointed time for the revelation of God. Okay. The second thing, and you could do a lot of reading in relation to this, but we're going to do a brief word study and contextual or reference study on the word testimony, testify. Okay? John mentions this all through his writings. Revelation is full of it. 1st, 2nd, 3rd John have it in there. The Gospel of John, I don't know how many times, maybe I can look it up, or feel free to do the search, but testimony, witness, testify are used multiple times by John. And Jesus, as John quoted Jesus in the Gospel. So we're going to take a look at that just for reference. John chapter 5 through 8, 1 John 5, and several places in Revelation talk about this concept of the testimony. So those are some things that we will look into in the early part of our next session. So we will finish there today. Hope this has been more than informative, but maybe a beginning to settle our hearts and minds and whatever anticipation that there may be about studying this particular writing. So we'll finish there today.
Yes,